كلها وطلبي سماح واستغفري وابكي على نفسك واندمي واعزمي على أن لا تعودي إلى هذه المعصية، ومن بعد روحي للحج لعل الله يغفر لك. سراقة، سرقتي أموال الزكاة، حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل. مسكين زوجك وداير فيك ثقة ويعطيك، وفي باله الناس يتدي والناس وانت تديها لنفسك. هاك سمعت هذا شاب واحد آخر من ريفة المسيلة، هذا الشاب من ريفة المسيلة، نريد منك يا شيخ أن تحدثنا عن جهنم. يا الله يستعان، واش بك أخويا؟ في رمضان أنت حاب تسمع جهنم؟ الناس حابة تسمع الجنة ورحمة، أنت حاب تسمع جهنم؟ وأنت وقتها خرجت من جهنم باش نحكي لك أنا على جهنم. جهنم فيها العقاب وأنتم ماكو عايشين مع العقاب. جهنم فيها الضيق وأنتم عايشين في الضيق، بيتو كوزينة وعايشين في الزنق. جهنم ما فيها لا ماكلة لا خير لا رحمة، وانتم وين؟ شوف كيف حالكم. ناس يتاكل بيد زبل، ناس يتاكل بيد زبل، ناس يعيش مع الطبات مع العقاب مع الحنوشة، وانا زين نحكي له على جهنم. ما هو عايش في جهنم يا وهذا سوء السير. راهو دخل الناس في جهنم قبل يوم القيامة، قبل يوم القيامة. لو كان تجبدوا صفات جهنم مثلا، جهنم سوداء ما فيهاش الضوء، وانتم تيجي تقدر تنقطع. اغلب الليالي اكو تجوزوها سوداء ما عندكمش الضوء. وجهنم فيها يعني كاع واش راك تصيب في جهنم، راك تصيب الناس راهم دخلوها قبل جهنم. يعني هذه الكارثه اللي وصلنا لها. الناس دخلوهم الجهنم قبل جهنم، قول يعوذ بالله. ما نحكي لكش على جهنم، هذه راك ان شاء الله صوم واستغفر وصلي، ادعي ربي سبحانه ويهديك الجهنم، ادعي ربي ما يديناش الله ويغفر لنا ويرحمنا ويسطانا. اذا شفت كيفاه؟ يعني جهنم ضيقة على أهلها، وانتم عايشين في بيوت الصابون، عايشين في مشاكل. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل. هذا مجموعة من رسول الله. سائل يقول: تعرفت بمحض الصدفة على امرأة مضطهدة من طرف زوجها، حيث أنها متزوجة بالفاتحة، ولما بنت مع زوجها الذي أبى ترسيم علاقته بها مدنيا، هذا الزوج يرغم زوجته على معاقرة ومعاشرة الرجال وإحضار النقود له، كما أنه يجعلها تبيت خارج البيت في حالة ما إذا رفضت ذلك، عدا أنه يجوعها ويمنع عنها المصروف. وقد طلبت مني هذه الزوجة بعد أن ضاقت ذرعا أن أساعدها في التطليق من زوجها، وأنا أريد أن أوكل لها محاميا يساعدها على أن تنجو بحياتها من هذا الرجل وبطشه، فهل هذا جائز؟ علما أنني سأتوسط لها أيضا في أن تحصل على عمل حتى يكون لها مورد رزق. أنا أنصحك يا سيدي، هذه المرأة إذا أرادت أن تتطلق من زوجها فعليها أن تذهب إلى المحكمة، واحد، وما تخممش مرة تعرف طريق المحكمة. أنا أخشى عليك من هذه المرأة. ثانيا، لا تصدقها، لا تصدقها. ماشي خدمتك انت خدمتك تخدم المرأة تاعك، روح لها بالمرأة تاعك، روح أحسن إلى زوجتك. هذا المرأة ما تدخلش روحك عندها راجلها، هي حكت لك، هي قالت لك أو يظلمني، يحقرني، يجوعني، يبيتني في الزنقة، يطلب بي الدراهم. هذا كلامها هي. أرادت أن تتطلق ما تعاونها بوالو، لا محامي لا حتى حاجة. روح تلها مرتك وولادك، خليها تروح للمحكمة، المحكمة تدير لها محامي وتدخل إلى جلسة الصلح، ويتحقق القاضي بالأدلة ثم يحكم لها أو عليها. لا تصدقها. وهذه تعرفت على امرأة بمحض الصدفة. يا أخي أنت خدمتك تتعرف على نساء بمحض الصدفة؟ روح تعرف على زوجتك، تلها مرتك. إياكم من هذه الشبكات. غير تجيك مرة تبدأ تطيح في الدموع، وراجل مسكين تغيدوا ومن بعدها هي تصور أنا امرأة ضعيفة في حاجة إلى من يحميني، وقيل لي أنك رجل شهم وأنا بحاجة إلى الحماية، يعني تحرك فيها الرجولة وتصيب الراجل زعما من باب الرجولة والشهامة. دعك من هذا، لا تصدقها، خليها هي تروح المحكمة. هذا كلامها، هذا بالك تضرب على الحقيقة، تصيب راجلها طيب وصالح وهي يعني هي مسودة الحالة. لا تصدقها يا أخي، دعك من هذا. روح اقضي لأولادك أمس وحشوم يا ومدين الحالة. صالح جاوبناه من بالسكرة. سيدي سائل من العاصمة سائلة تقول طلقني زوجي منذ 11 سنة ولم يقبل بي أهلي بينهم، فكان التشرد نصيبي أنا وابنتي. مشكلتي أن زوجي ومنذ طلاقي لم ينفق على ابنته يوما، كما أنه لا يعرفها أبدا، ولأنني مشتاقة، هكذا تقول مشتاقة أو لست أدري ماذا تقصد، ولأن ظروفي جد قاسرة، فقد اضطررت كذا مرة لممارسة الرذيلة فقط حتى أطعم ابنتي. حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل، حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل. فهل من نصيحة لزوجي السابق؟ وانت ما نصحوكش انت ألا تذهبي إلى الزنا، كان بإمكانك بنتك هذه ما قدرتيش توكليها الحلال، تروحي تعطيها إلى عائلة يحوسوا على طفلة يربيوها بالحلال. واش الفايدة كي ديتي طفلة وكلتيها الحرام، وكلتيها أموال الزنا وأموال الفحشاء؟ راني متأكد لو كان دقدقتي لأي بيت من المسلمين قال هاي طفلاني خايفة تموت، يوكلوها ويشربوها ويبيتوها ويحسنون إليها. لكن أنت فضلتي طريق الحرام. وزعما روح انصح راجلك حرام عليه لأنه ترك النفقة على ابنته، وانت راك ارتكبتي حد من حدود الله وكبيرة من الكبائر. واش تقولي لربي يوم القيامة؟ فهل من نصيحة لزوجي السابق؟ ما أنت عندك زوجك اللاحق وقيل حتى يخاف الله في ابنته التي لم يكفلها هجره أو يكفيها هجره ولا هجره، حتى حرمها أيضا من حقها في النفقة. وما هو حكم امرأة إذ طرتها الظروف؟ لا، هذا كذب يا أختي، هذا كذب، هذا كذب، لأن ربي يفتح باب الكفالة. لما شفتي نفسك ماشي قادرة تعيشي هذه الطفلة وتأكد عندك أن ما عندكش مخرج يعني إلا أن تذهبي إلى الزنا، لو كان مديتيها لأي عائلة من المسلمين الكفالة موجودة. حتى باعت جسدها بالرخيص فقط حتى تطعم ابنتها. حرام عليك يا أختي، وارتكبت حد من حدود الله جل جلاله، والواجب عليك أن تتوبي وتستغفري وتندمي على ما فعلت وتعزمي على ألا تعودي. الإسلام في الموسيقى والغناء، الموسيقى والغناء مسألة مختلف فيها. علاه؟ لأن الغناء مختلف فيه، ماهوش حاجة واحدة، ماهوش حاجة واحدة. واحد يغني سبحان الله يلطف، وواحد يغني قلبي وقلبك معلقين في البوشي، ماشي كيف كيف. الكلمات مختلفة، لما اختلفت الكلمات اختلف الحكم. واحد يغني خبزي مخدوم من الشعير ماهوش مسلف يعلم الناس رجله والنيف، وواحد يغني مع أوريكو مصياص ويعني في الحرام ويروح يشطح في المروك، هذه حرام عليه. اما لا محسوب الغناء هذا أو موضوع مختلف، فاختلف الحكم. ولذلك العلماء اللي قالوا حلال والآخر اللي قالوا حرام، كل واحد شاف الغناء من زاوية، ولكن المتفق عليه أن الغناء الفاحش حرام، إذا كان فاحش حرام، والباقي مختلف فيه. هذه امرأة تسأل عن القيء في رمضان. لقيا يجيها لقيا في رمضان. القيء كاين 4 حالات، 4 حالات اشفوا عليها. كاين خطرات يكون القيء غلبة، يغلبك ويعاود يولي غلبة، يخرج غلبة ويولي الحلق تاعك غلبة. هنا عليك القضاء ولا إثم عليك. عليك القضاء على النهار هذا، تقضي نهار وما عليكش الإثم. خطرة القيء لا يكون غلبة يغلبك ويولي عمدا. إنسان يتقيا غلبة ومن بعد يشوف هذيك البوراكة ولا الظلمة خارجة، هي عاود يردها، يخاف تروح له. يقول لك هذا الحمى أو 120 في الكيلو، كيف نخليه يخرج؟ أما لا يتقياها غلبة ويعاود يردها عمدا، هذا عليه القضاء والكفارة. القضاء والكفارة. هذا على هذا الشيء اللي رديته عمدا تقضي نهار وتطعم 60 مسكين. تطعم 60 مسكين. الإطعام عند الإمام مالك أفضل من صيام 60 يوم، لأن 60 يوم حتنفع نفسك، وإطعام 60 مسكين حتنفع المسلمين. مال الإمام مالك كان يرى إطعام 60 مسكين أفضل من صيام 60 يوم. الحالة الثالثة أنه ما يعني تتعمد، إنسان يتعمد يقي روحه، يتعمد يقي روحه وما يولي له والو، يتعمد يقي روحه وما يولي له والو، هذا كذلك عليه القضاء. من أراد شيئا عوقب بخلافه، ومن استعجل الشيء قبل أوانه عوقب بحرمانه، ما لا هذا عليه القضاء. وكاين حالة رابعة، إنسان تعمد يخرج ما تعمدش يخرج لقيا وما ولا له والو، ما تعمدش يخرج لقيا وما ولا له والو، فهذا لا شيء عليه. أما مسألة القلس، وشنو هو القلس؟ أفهموا باش نختم بها. القالس هو هذاك اللي يجيك تاع الشوربه. احنا اغلب الجزائريين يتصحروا بالشوربه، وكاين بزاف اللي يتصحروا الطعام بالزبيب. الطعام بالزبيب هو قيل يدير 80 في الكيلو. اما لا اللي يتصحر بالشوربه من بعد في النهار يجيه قالس. وشنو القيس؟ ما هو قيام، ما يخرج ما يدخل، يقعد غير هنا او يخرخش، يقعد تم قروصيه مار، ما يخرج ما يدخل. القالس إذا كان ما خرج لا شيء عليك، إذا خرج عنده نفس الأحكام اللي ذكرتها في القياء.
هل صحيح أن لغة أهل الجنة هي اللغة العربية؟ يا وادخلها بارك، يا وادخل بارك للجنة ومن بعد هذا بلغة الزولو إن كان مبروك عليك. وشك علاك تحوس أنت لغة أهل الجنة؟ وش حتفيدك؟ قل لي وش حتفيدك؟ وش حتفيدك في الحياة الدنيا هذه؟ وش حتفيدك في صلاتك، في زكاتك، في صومك، في حجك؟ راك مليح مع باباك، مليح مع يماك، مليح مع جارك، ما راكش تغش، ما راكش تكذب، ما راكش تسرق. وبقات لك غير مسألة لغة أهل الجنة باش يهضروا بيناتهم. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. ادخل برك للجنة. كان الشيخ محمد رحوة رضي الله عنه شيخي كان يقول لي يا وليدي ادعي ربي ما يديناش للنار، اما وين الدانا الدانا يدخلك للجنه تحت شوصي، تحت الدروج، يعطيك بيت وكوزينه، المهم ما تروحش للنار. فهمت؟ اما لا موضوع لغه اهل الجنه، اسمع ما اقول لك. كاين حديث ضعيف وقيل موضوع، يقول عليه الصلاه والسلام احب العرب لثلاث، لاني احب العرب لثلاث، لاني عربي والقرآن عربي وكلام أهل الجنة عربي. طالب جامعي، انت لازم يسموك طلاب جامعي. على سبيل المنحة لم يعطوها لكم بقشيش، ما ولاش عندنا طالب جامعي، عندنا طلاب جامعي مسكين. طلاب، هي المفروض أن الدولة تنفق على طلبة العلم، لأن هذوما المستقبل، هذوما العلماء، هذوما رجال المستقبل. هذا منهم ما حيكون المهندس والطبيب والوزير والقائد والعسكري، وكل واحد حيكون من هذه الشريحة طلبة العلم. لكن على سبيل المنحة لنا نسمعوا بها، هاكو تشوفوا ما عندهمش حتى السخان يسخن لهم الماء. أما الجواب الشرعي، اسمعني، إذا كنت تخشى على صحتك جاز لك أن تتيمم. إذا كاين خوف على الصحة، ماشي فنيان فنيان وعايش يعني في البحبوحة وتخاف الماء بارد، لا. إذا كاين سبب شرعي يعني غلب على ظنك أنك تمرض، هنا يجوز الانتقال إلى التيمم. فصل، واش قال ابن عاشر؟ فصل لخوف ضرر أو عدم ما عوض من الطهارة التيمم. فصل لخوف ضرر أو عدم ما عوض من الطهارة التيمم. اكتبها. فصل لخوف ضرر أو عدم ما عوض من الطهارة التيمم. وصل فرضا واحدا وإن تصل جنازة وسنة به يحل. إذا خشيت على نفسك الضرر جاز لك أن تتيمم. 2. إذا راك مريض ولكن لو كان تتيمم ما تبراش جاز لك أن تتيمم. 3. تبعني مليح. راك مريض وراك تشرب في الدواء ولكن لو كانت تتعامل مع الماء تبرى، ولكن تبرى ماشي بسرعة، يعني تبطأ باش تبرى. ملي كنت راح تبرى في 3 أيام ممكن تبرى في 6 أيام، جاز لك أن تتيمم. إذا كانت أنت تخشى على نفسك المرض جاز لك. فهمتها ولا ما فهمتهاش؟ الله يفهمنا ويعلمنا، واللي يفهم يفهم، اللي ما فهمش حنايا نديروا المفتاح وربي هو الفتاح. طالب جامعي مسكين راهم يتضربوا غير على الماكلة والكاش.
You told me once to forget the past because it doesn't matter. But nothing good came of it. There was no place for me to return to. This was the only place I could go. What are you going to do? Just throw your life away like it was nothing?
I'm not going there to die. I'm going to find out if I'm really alive.
There is no hierarchy of art. By saying this, I want to counteract the belief that any form of artistic expression possesses a higher intrinsic value than another. When discussing art, the prerequisite to find a medium's worth is often diluted to a measurement of its disposability, a generalised perception that suggests one form to be more cultivated, thus more necessary than its peer. And of course, the conflict of cinema versus television is where this notion emerges most frequently. The idea that television is an expendable form, I believe, needs to be eradicated, because the anatomy of the televisual medium is endowed with methods of storytelling unobtainable in film. For example, the clearest benefit of a serialized story is length. More than cinema, television can grow in complexity over a longer lasting period. A character isn't confined to a 2-hour tale, and their intricacies can thus blossom with patience. However, what may not be instantly recognised as a crucial storytelling device is the episodic nature of television. A consortium of 3-act structures inside of a larger 3-act structure, much like chapters in a novel, can imbue a lyrical quality to a story, wherein themes and ideas are found through repetition and re-emergence. Few shows have a reliance on this method of storytelling, even fewer in which every episode will be circumscribed to a unique story and universe. Yet beneath the main narrative it constructs, it's inside this melting pot of individual stories that we can discover the identity of Cowboy Bebop. Can we as humans find purpose beyond survival? These ontological thoughts and labels are the same existential drift our characters repeatedly find themselves in, and is what is most significant to the journey of Cowboy Bebop. Its science fiction setting, following a crew of bounty hunters and their unique adventures, is all peripheral. Because when we dissect the whole piece rather than analyse each separate episode, the series becomes a metaphysical expression of how people overcome their lives, particularly the lingering grief that comes along with them. Bebop offers a unique portrait in the manner in which life plays itself out. It's less of a linear path towards a goal, more of a haze that we must venture through without any guidance. Because the sad reality of Bebop's story is that our cast of characters are lost in the cosmos without any justification for why they live, other than to exist. And the only recurrent theme that provides any kind of motive for them is the reconciliation with one's past.
This is what I paid, yeah, for being too gung-ho and running ahead of the game. You get the point?
I don't want to do this, Jet.
Look at me, where she wanna be. Call me Ricky T. Call me Ricky T.
Yet why deliver it in such episodic fashion? The compendium of episodes, rather than forming a continuing arc, is comprised of individual plots. Whether hunting a chess master or a computer hacker, the basic formula for Bebop remains consistent. We're introduced to a bounty, the crew pursues them, the episode concludes. Admittedly, this is a lame description, because when we examine the essence of Cowboy Bebop, we discover this episodic formula servicing something very transgressive. Understanding its structure is the first step to discovering meaning in Cowboy Bebop. Although each episode focuses on a new character or plot, the stories themselves have no direct association to the narratives of our main protagonists. And though the colourful crew of Spike and Company is the one consistent element of the series, the real subjects of each episode are only viewed through their lens. Our characters are typically the secondary facets in the story presently unfolding. They're either the obstacles that must be overcome, or more often than not, are merely involved through circumstance.
Hang on to this!
Huh?
Meet me tonight, no, tomorrow night at the cathedral on the edge of town.
What?
Hey, wait!
There he is! Get him!
Our protagonists are made to be distant to the events from the outset, because as important as these stories may be to the subjects directly involved, to our characters, these stories don't matter. Why? Because each of our protagonists has a past they hold on to dearly, a past ever present in their mind, which isolates them to a world where only their concerns are relevant. For the crew of the Bebop, they yearn for their own narratives to be addressed rather than serve as a background for the narratives of others. They narrowed their view of the world to believe that nothing else could be more important, yet they don't allow themselves the reality that there are others that suffer through the same fate. And so the only survival tactic they can employ to overcome these feelings is to distance themselves from the personal strife of others. Stoicism.
What? Are you for real? We can't live
Oh, well.
without them. I knew I
Whatever
should've loved you.
happens,
I'm only 18.
happens.
I don't wanna...
The lack of affection, the sidestepping of personal responsibility, Spike and the rest of the crew utilise this whatever happens, happens approach. Not because they actually believe it, but because it's a replacement for their avoidance of reality. The truth that these strangers that they interact with are nothing more than reflections of themselves. Humans that are willing to sacrifice everything for harmony and purpose in their lives. Just as our protagonists can't afford to form attachments to these unique characters, the same is also said for the subjects in question. They aren't concerned about the struggles of our protagonists because every person that we see is living an existence forged by their pasts, and they do anything to make things right. Even though our characters recognise the struggle within every person they encounter, they have to live their lives vicariously through others because their own is so empty.
Empty time. It sounds good to call bounty hunting freelance work, but all that really means is that we're self-employed. So when there's no one to hunt, we have nothing. Nothing to do, nothing to live on.
Because imagine living a life of regret, a life in which your past feels unfinished, as though there were a piece missing and you have to find it. Our characters are unable to live with purpose in the present because of the sorrows chaining them to their past. They're the detached outcasts that were once part of this world, but now act as stray souls unable to form a connection inside it. Whether it's Faye unable to remember her earlier years, or Jet unable to fathom the loss of his previous life, our characters' regrets manifest into indifference to the world surrounding them. Every episode ends back with our crew just marking time. It's as though the events that occur never happened. They already feel so distant, and because of the series' episodic nature, are never mentioned again. Our characters don't want to acknowledge the hardships of others because they can't risk opening themselves completely for fear of even further misery. Their past is the priority, and it's hard to put anything else first when you already live with so much sorrow.
I'm not going there to die. I'm going to find out if I'm really alive. I have to do it, Faye.
The constant search for purpose is the summary of our characters' lives, which means an endless urge to impose meaning in each insignificant day-to-day moment. Bertrand Russell once described philosophy as a no man's land, that which isn't currently known. And to me, this is the most apropos description of Cowboy Bebop's depiction of how we journey through life. Although saturated with ennui and silent moments of contemplation, the grandiose ideas dispensed through Cowboy Bebop are done in a manner that seems unfulfilling and almost incomplete. The characters don't have answers, they just hypothesize.
Who am I? My past? My future? These are questions every human asks at least once in their life.
Does the show work on the theory of Kant that we're all selfish?
I'm gonna go look for my woman. You can go look for the other one.
Or does it propose a more humanistic view of us?
What's your price to keep from leaking this thing to the press?
Just leave the old guy alone. Call off the bounty hunters. That's all we ask.
These constant contradictions and questions suggest that any philosophy our characters implement is never consistent, and it leads to the show's brutally honest reminder that no matter how much we convince ourselves, the majority of our lives are lived without purpose. There is no unifying belief that makes everything connect. The truth is often the simplest answer.
But I still don't know why it carved pictures of weird creatures and all. What in the world was that all about, huh?
That's easy. It was lonely, so it drew some friends.
But our characters act as though if they keep searching, perhaps they will discover life's greater purpose, because they fear to acknowledge that they've built an existence fused to their past, and that until that point, all they do is wait. Wait endlessly for something or someone to make everything okay again. Thus, they'll fabricate an individual philosophy as a way to avoid this truth. It's an accurate depiction of the human race. We'll do anything to find meaning in the meaninglessness, because the truth of the matter is that as humans we typically have only one goal in our minds, finding that one connection that makes us feel whole, and everything up to that point is devoid of any true meaning. Our characters want to feel connected, but avoid the truth that their only objective is simply awaiting the confrontation with whatever spawned the emptiness they feel.
Men only think about the past right before their death, as if they were searching frantically for proof that they were alive.
Eventually, our main characters are confronted with their past, and at these moments, their behaviour radically changes. Much like the rest of the inhabitants within this universe, they become willing to abandon everything in pursuit of it. Their passivity dissipates, revealing their vulnerabilities and their true nature.
You think I'm vicious? You don't know what vicious is!
And this sudden 180 in attitude tied to the episodic vision of the show reveals Cowboy Bebop's true message to the audience. We followed the stories of various characters, which in the larger picture may first seem meaningless. However, if we consider how this episodic format is thought of in the mind of our main character, it's reflective of what most of our lives are, a singular sequence of unrelated events that affect us indirectly. The subjects of each episode serve as a separate entity to Bebop's overarching narrative. These unique characters that make up the catalogue of the human experience completely contrast the unempathic stature of our protagonists. The playful, the melancholic, the absurd. Why such a division? Because what Cowboy Bebop is a demonstration of a subject viewed by the outsider. A display of how the attitudes of that surrounding us will affect our perceptions. Our main characters were constantly surrounded by others who were able to confront their pasts, while they were still searching for their own catharsis.
Look at me, where she wanna be, call me Vicky.
Circumscribed to its own universe. To our characters,
look at me, where she wanna be, call me Vicky.
One single event, creating a mindset in them that clearly the past was something which had to be reconciled with. To the audience, we saw an episodic formula. To the characters, it was all one giant episode. In each unique plot, they saw a continuous, unchangeable pattern of the different way people confront their lives, and creates this mosaic in which our protagonists were able to gain an objective glimpse at the unpredictable nature of life to others, and one that would be reflected upon with an almost grim nostalgia.
Oh, Ed, anything but blue.
But when they themselves finally are able to confront their past, what happens? They no longer have this objectivity because they view everything through a sole egocentric view. They finally become the subject of the story, something they've longed for through the entire series. But then, who becomes the outsider? Us. At the finale of the series, we're greeted with the phrase, "You're gonna carry that weight." Originally, Spike was our subject, and the characters of each episode were his subjects. We watch Spike watch others. But when Spike has no more subjects to view, he unconsciously becomes them, confronting his past with no concern for others. And the show realises that in turn, we have become Spike. We're the outsider finally watching a man confront his past unfiltered, just as Spike did. This time, we've been given the context as to why it's so important for him to pursue it, and at its finale, Cowboy Bebop demonstrates its grandest subversion by making us the focus. Just as Spike carried the weight of everybody else he encountered, Bebop asks us to do the same. View the entire work of art it's presented us with, the entire chronology of Spike's story, and asks, will we merely carry the burden of seeing someone confront their own past, or will it be the catalyst we needed of how we are to confront our own? Regardless of our choice, nothing changes what we saw. Nothing changes what happened. The past is going to stay with us. We're gonna carry that weight. For me, the entire message of Cowboy Bebop can be summed up at the end of the episode Jupiter Jazz. Our heroes didn't succeed in what they aimed to achieve, and so they must wait, and until their next opportunity, it's nothing more than survival. But there's nothing wrong with this. Cowboy Bebop never displays pessimism in this lack of meaning in life, because it teaches us that although the universe doesn't owe us purpose or hope, we're still the creators of our own destiny. Every single person you encounter has a past, has suffered more than just ourselves. But the truth is, if we want to live a life where we create our own meaning, we must accept our pasts, because if we hold on to them, they'll chain us to a tunnel vision of life. Even when this was explained, look at me, where she wanna be, call me Vicky. Where she wanna be, call me Vicky T. Off the leash, call me Vicky T. Off the leash, I feel like a dog. Look at me, where she want me, where she.
Bang.
Only after his confrontation,
look at me,
Spike
where she
realized
wanna be,
all our
call me
characters had
Vicky
to
T.
accept their past
Where she
one way
wanna
or the
be,
other, because it was the only way that they could form their own destiny. But by then, his choice had been made.
Bang.
The final image of Bebop offers a sense of finality. As Spike becomes immortalized,
at me, where she wanna be, call me.
This is how he's remembered, and it shows that he truly had nothing else to live for. Becoming
Where she
so
wanna
chained
be,
to his
call me
history
Vicky.
meant that Spike's objective was to confront his past and nothing more.
Call me
But
Vicky.
as we see, the remaining characters continue to survive. Just like how once the subjects of each episode dealt with their pasts, the lives of the Bebop crew continued. No matter what your struggles are, everybody around us will carry on. Surely that offers some kind of hope in life. We each have our own stories to live, but we can't let ourselves be shackled to our own sadness. There must be some closure. Yet once we've learned the acceptance of our past, we will finally be able to live whichever life we please.
Look at me, where she wanna be, call me Vicky T. Me, where she wanna be, call me Vicky T. Where she wanna be, call me
You can stop right there, Leon.
Look at me, where she wanna be, call me Vicky T. Look at me, where she wanna be, call. Look at me, where she.
By now, we have a rough idea how the story of cinema goes. Everyone knows the basics of early cinema and how that transitioned into modern and then contemporary cinema, and we fill in the gaps with the most important eras and regions of film in a simple chronology. We typically use these movements to craft a timeline of cinema, those conscious decisions, often made by collectives of filmmakers and artists that seek to work toward the same goal. We've had the school of Soviet montage, the Nouvelle Vague, Dogma 95, and within all of these movements stood an array of filmmakers and theorists that aim to mould the cinematic landscape through new modes of thought. Manifestos were written, rules were established, and for many of them, these were the new and absolute methods to alter our vision of film.
And then I read the manifesto, and then they asked me questions, and I said I was allowed by the brothers to read the manifestos, but not to discuss it. I thought that was very clever.
But what is the best moment in cinema? Now, this is obviously subjective. When you're dealing with the masters of any craft, it can ultimately come down to personal taste. So then perhaps the question should be, At what point was there the greatest concentration of filmmakers? And what if the era that I proposed wasn't part of a movement at all? That they did not consciously come together? That they were products of circumstance and environment that encouraged them to create their greatest works? An environment that had altered so drastically in such a short period that there was no choice but to create something equally as altering. This is the story of a 10-year period in Japan, wherein concentrated within a single country were some of the greatest filmmakers to ever live, simultaneously producing their greatest works. The result was a complete decentralization of classic cinema as the world was exposed to its new troupe of masters. It didn't have a name and it wasn't planned, but it's most often thought of as the golden age of Japanese cinema. There isn't exactly a specific date that we can refer to as the golden age of Japanese cinema, because it's not a canonized idea within cinematic chronology. It's more of a colloquial terminology. But for the sake of categorization, we think of the golden age as the 1950s. So why then is it perceived as a golden age, an age of magnificent quality beyond all other ages? Well, for one, it's because the greatest filmmakers of Japan made their magnum opuses within this decade. Kurosawa made Seven Samurai, Ozu made Tokyo Story, Kinugasa made Gate of Hell, Inagaki made the Samurai Trilogy, and I could go on and on. It's an era of quality for the nation that supersedes all others, one of unparalleled excellence. But this reputation has in truth become mythologized in the eyes of film historians as though it was some divine miracle that Japan all of a sudden became the epicenter of such a rich cinematic culture. So let's clarify something about this. The Japanese Golden Age is commonly thought of as the starting point for great Japanese cinema. Everything that was to follow was in the footsteps of these new masters. The truth is, in Japan, the filmmakers that make up the Golden Age were already known. In fact, filmmakers like Ozu, Mizoguchi, and Naruse had been making films for around 30 years. Although it remains true that most filmmakers produced their best work within this period, it was more so that Japanese filmmakers did not have the means to be recognized on the world stage. It's a rather egregious reality, and to give a comparison, an equivalent would be if Martin Scorsese did not get global recognition until around the year 2000. This is the kind of narrative that we're accepting if we believe that the Golden Age emerges from a vacuum. The fact of the matter is, you can only truly understand this decade of film when you understand what came before it. You have to begin setting the stage for this era with its historical context, because without it, the Golden Age most likely doesn't exist. At the end of World War II, Japan was exposed to a harsh realization of its position on the global stage. Its landscape had been annihilated by the atomic bomb, resulting in the surrender of the Japanese. The infallible and divine Emperor Hirohito formally renounced his divinity after the unthinkable surrender, revealing himself to be human after all. This horrifying realization for the Japanese people, that the guise of everything that they believed they were, collapsed in a matter of moments. Their sacred right to rule supreme had fallen, and the veneer of such a global dominance was swiftly wiped away. After the end of the war, Japan was left with the reality that they were an ethnically homogeneous and culturally unified unit that did not fit in with the new democratic world. And although we can't ignore the collective psychological toil placed upon a nation after losing the most deadly war in history, and how that certainly had some effect on what it produced, it was what came directly following the war that actively impacted Japanese cinema. Japan was now occupied by the United States. During the Allied occupation of Japan, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers was responsible for controlling and suppressing any Japanese military nationalism. This position was referred to in Japan as GHQ, or General Headquarters. Now, two of the subsidiaries of GHQ was specifically responsible for media control of Japan during this period, CIE and CCD. And the members that made up these bodies were not government officials nor artistic consultants, they were all military personnel. This meant that there was a military censorship operation that took control of the entire Japanese film industry from 1945 until 1952. This meant for any Japanese filmmaker during this period, every concept and screenplay had to be fully translated into English and run through these two bodies of censorship. And this rule applied to every film. Many filmmakers suffered because of this. Makino Masahiro stopped making films altogether during this period, and director Takasa Tomotaka was recuperating from being poisoned by radiation in Hiroshima. Now bear in mind, as I mentioned, this was still during the careers of these masters, many of them at the height of their career. And now, this great collective has to have their work suppressed and censored by an outsider force. One of the few other periods in cinema which can match the saturation of filmmakers that came from Japan is probably the US cinema of the 1970s. But can you imagine a completely different culture dictating what could be made by Scorsese, Coppola and Spielberg? It would be a travesty to do such a thing, which ultimately it was. So what were the laws regarding censorship during this period? Well, in November of 1945, the head of the CIA, David Condi, listed 13 things that were to be banned from all Japanese cinema. These included nationalism, patriotism, revenge stories, and finally any film that opposed GHQ directives, which ultimately meant that they were at liberty to ban and censor anything that they felt they should. This level of censorship meant that what distinguished revolting Japanese sentiment and Japanese culture became blurred. For instance, any depiction of a katana was not allowed, and GHQ took extreme care for any imagery that could evoke Japanese national sentiment to be prohibited. As a consequence of this, when Makino Masahiro wanted to depict Mount Fuji, it was deemed a nationalist symbol and told that he couldn't. Even bowing, which has feudal connotations, was considered an issue by the censors. Even the great films of the masters that were released in this era were subject to the same harsh standards. Late Spring by Ozu originally had a line in which the father states that Tokyo is still filled with bomb sites. After the censorship, he now says, the hands of the Japanese were firmly tied. They had no choice but to abide by the new directives. And so it was during this period of censorship that filmmakers were incredibly limited as to what type of films they could make. The idea films were pushed to the forefront as films that could promote American individualism and democratic ideas that fell in line with the Hollywood standard of the time. A few years ago, they were ordered to make films to boost Japanese militarism, and now they were ordered to do the exact opposite. The filmmakers of Japan were used as tools for propaganda. All sense of their cultural identity was becoming slowly absorbed by the American democratic machine. The United States aimed to instill its own values onto Japan through its cinema, part of the reverse force operation. Now, the landscape of cinema differed much more than the fluidity of styles that we have today. This was still in the era of genre films, and the genre films of the Japanese were as specific as they were in the West. The most prevalent genre film was the Jidaigeki, which we would essentially think of as a period film. A subgenre of this, and the most popular, would be the Chanbara, which is the samurai film. However, because of the censorship, no fealty to feudalism and no nationalist iconography was to be used in these films, and so the Jidaigeki was completely dismissed. If you ever wonder why there's a large gap of period films within Japanese cinema, it's because the censorship period made it impossible by law to produce them. There was ultimately no other option. Every film had to be a shomingeki, which is a common person drama, because also that was the position that everyone was in, a common person struggling with modern life. So why isn't this era, a more discussed period within cinema. The US essentially committed subterfuge to promote Western propaganda and inhibit Japanese voices. Well, it's because this censorship was supposed to be completely hidden. This covert censorship not only was impacting the present-day cinema in Japan, but they sought to retroactively reshape Japanese cinema by attacking its history. In 1946, some 500 movies were selected of Japanese cinema that were deemed taboo, and it's expected that around half of them were burned. Some of the larger studios took the preemptive measure of burning their own works that they felt would have failed these measures, as they were preparing to be punished as a type of low-level propagandist for the Japanese war effort. Many of the films were passed over to the Library of Congress, but with no listing or cataloguing of what was chosen in the 1946 burning, no one is entirely certain as to what was and what wasn't destroyed at this time. When you examine the filmographies of the master filmmakers of Japanese cinema, what you'll notice is that an extensive portion of their early work is completely missing. Compared to filmmakers from every other continent of the same era, there's no comparison. Fritz Lang, who fled Germany due to Nazi persecution, has a surviving filmography. One can only assume the breadth of masterpieces that were destroyed in a single act of military censorship. Who knows how the narrative of cinema would differ with these films still intact. And so you have all of these restrictions on the innate Japanese culture. The masters of the craft inhibited as to what they can make, and the country exposed to a variety of foreign customs such as American animation, which had been previously banned by the emperor. The result was a rapidly shifting cultural milieu. And the shift in mindset is perhaps best exemplified in the banned film of the time, A Japanese Tragedy, where the once mighty Hirohito fades into a salary worker. The image reflective of how the once ardent Japanese, it would now seem, must submit to its new cultural sovereign. But hope was on the horizon. Towards the end of the Allied occupation, the restrictions of the military censorship gradually started to wane. This leads to the agreed point in which film historians refer to for when Japanese cinema was, quote, discovered. The Venice Film Festival, 1951. It's at this festival Rashomon by Kurosawa is screened without the director's knowledge. It wins the Golden Lion. It also goes on to receive an Academy Award that same year. From that point on, every single festival lineup prioritizes Japanese cinema. The censorship ends, and the golden age of Japanese cinema blossoms. So it was just one film that spurred on this renaissance of cinema? Of course not. However, Rashomon is undoubtedly the unanimous starting point. The film was remarkably original. Kurosawa implemented a brand new narrative structure, telling stories within a story, and highlighting a perspectivism within film which perhaps hasn't been matched to this day. A single story told from 4 different points of view, and how each person tells the story differently. Kurosawa also announced himself with a bold and expressive directing style, a constantly moving camera, shooting directly into the sunlight. This was an exciting and new cinematic language. The film festival circuit would prove crucial, as over the next decade, the awards season became saturated. Golden Lions, Academy Awards, and Palme d'Ors awarded to Japanese films. From 1951 onwards, countries outside of Japan were first exposed to Japanese cinema. And what undeniably helped the cause was that a large portion of them were period dramas. After the dissolution of the censorship, there was an onslaught of jidaigeki films, the type of films that would become so intrinsic to Japanese cinema and exactly the kind of thing that they'd been unable to make for the past several years. There were Orientalist desires from Western audiences at the time which aimed to be satiated by such films. Nagata Misaichi, the head of Studio Daiei, felt that period films would be much more appealing for foreigners, and so during this period made a conscious effort to produce more films within the jidaigeki genre. And it worked. It's why many more social realist filmmakers that operated in the gendaigeki genre, such as Ozu, didn't receive such a reputation until many years later. And so most of the revered films of this period were built upon those traditional genre films that preceded it. And it was the Western exposure to these films that helped in finally giving these artists the platform that they deserved. What we also have to realize during this period is that this era of Japanese cinema that we think of as the Golden Age was also the period of mass-produced studio films. Whereas most countries failed to capitalize on the Hollywood studio system that had made the US so successful, Japan actually were able to implement a similar system, even mirroring Hollywood studios with their own Big Five. These were Toho, Daiei, Shochiku, Nikatsu, and Toei. However, the fact of the matter is that back then, studios could only increase their chances of success by making the greatest films that they possibly could. And so these 5 studios hired the best artists of the time and gave them the financial backing and creative freedom that they needed. The result was that the studios made a lot of money, the filmmakers created an abundance of masterpieces, and the golden age of Japanese cinema meant that people filled the theatres. To give an idea of the growth of their film industry, in 1946, at the beginning of the censorship, Japan had 1,376 theatres. In 1952, once the Golden Age had begun, this increased to 4,109. And by 1960, at the end of the age, this number was 7,457. The studios were capitalising on the public's desire for the Japanese perspective, and they sought to appease this by saturating the market with only the best. Toho, as the most popular studio, had major focuses in its release schedule. Outside of the regular comedy releases that they had, the director to which they gave their primary attention was Kurosawa. Kurosawa was known as the father of the samurai film, although a more appropriate envisioning of his role was that he resurrected the genre. There were a plethora of pre-war samurai films. However, Kurosawa came with his own transgressions on the perceptions of Bushido. Rather than having samurai that were absolutely subservient to a code, we saw them as heroes, but oftentimes they were selfish, other times they were rebels. The cornerstone to his approach is that for the first time, the samurai was seen foremost as human. He delved into character psychology and removed them from the traditional archetypes of the past. And during the peak of his career, when you thought of Kurosawa, you would either think of men with swords or men with suits. What Kurosawa did for cinema as a whole was what most filmmakers hope at some point to do, and that is to bridge the gap between one's artistry and mainstream appeal. For all intents and purposes, Kurosawa was making art house cinema. Rashomon was altering the very structure of narrative film. And throughout the decade, most of his films were adaptations of Dostoevsky and Shakespeare. However, Kurosawa re-envisioned art house cinema as something not denoted with the intellect, but one that was purely sensorial. While he was moulding cinematic language with his radical new aesthetic, he was captivating his audiences, with Seven Samurai ending the year as the top-grossing film in Japan. Kurosawa's filmmaking brought an unseen kinetic energy to film, utilising long lenses that give a shallower depth to his backgrounds, multiple moving cameras within a single scene, and rapid editing often juxtaposed with slow-motion sequences. Movement is the principal factor within Kurosawa's frames, and the grandiose maximalism of his images testify to this grand feat of movement. Although taking much inspiration from Western filmmakers, it would come full circle, as Kurosawa's work became instrumental for the Western genre. Kurosawa shot and edited as he went along, giving his films a three-dimensionality. Take any frame from Kurosawa and watch how he guides motion in the most dramatic fashion. His wipe transition was what Guy Deleuze called the breath that wipes away the void. It brought an equalizing factor between everything on screen. Although it's a story about warriors, it's also about the humble person. Kurosawa, with all of his grandeur, still focused on the human being first. And although Kurosawa was and remains the most well-established, well-regarded and highly distributed Japanese filmmaker in the West, he was one of just many filmmakers worthy of recognition and study during this decade. Many of the studios had their own filmmaker that served as a contractor director and became a staple. Beginning at Toho before moving to Daiei, Kenji Mizoguchi became their most important figure. And as stated earlier, although having an expansive career prior to the censorship, Daiei ensured that his newest projects emphasized the Jidaigeki genre. During the censorship, Mizoguchi perhaps navigated the restrictions better than most, but all of his films following its collapse were historical films, until his death shortly after, in 1956. Mizoguchi was not like Kurosawa, and rather emphasized the space in his images. His camera too was constantly moving. However, rather than the rapidity of Kurosawa's movement, Mizoguchi's was slow and ethereal. He traversed his spaces in a ghostly manner, as though the space was somewhere transient. This matched the thematics in which he garnered most interest. In Ugetsu, it's between life and death. The gaze of Mizoguchi is a transcendental one, as the women in his films are viewed as some otherworldly mystical entity. When you think of Mizoguchi, you think of panoramic cameras, clearly demonstrating that he was most inspired by the Imakimono painting style. There are no close-ups in his work, as he focuses on the impermanence of things in a spacious and spiritual imagery. Mizoguchi is the director responsible for some of the most human films, those that juxtapose the plight of human suffering with the boundless depth of human love. Meanwhile, at Shochiku, they were responsible for the distribution of Ozu films. Ozu was the creator of the home drama, whose films were the simplest and the quietest of the three directors, and whose style was unflinching throughout the entirety of his career. Static cameras, characters speaking directly into the lens, and an emphasis on composition through the geometry of traditional Japanese architecture. His films are quiet and exemplify the Japanese way of living, capturing the transient and most fleeting of human emotions through the depiction of the Japanese family structure. Although not as grandiose as Kurosawa, nor as spiritual as Mizoguchi, Ozu epitomizes a sentimentality that perhaps has not been as well achieved by any other filmmaker to this day. These are often thought of as the champions of classic Japanese cinema. However, they are just the surface level of a rich and thriving industry. Toho also had Mikio Naruse, who was too creating his best work during this era, and Kobayashi was releasing the Human Condition trilogy, just to point out how rich this period of time was in producing great films. But like many moments in history, the rise of Japanese cinema also benefited from nothing other than good fortune. In 1951, at almost the same time as the emergence of Japanese cinema as a unique force, Cahiers du Cinéma launches its first issue. Led primarily by the writings of André Bazin, as well as his quasi-apprentices such as François Truffaut, it's during the 1950s that they examine the cinema of the United States and begin to reappraise its filmmakers, such as the work of Alfred Hitchcock and John Ford. They propose that although they were popular directors working under a studio system, their unique brand of cinematic language was based in innovation. Although the studio system wanted certain things, this didn't have much impact on the creative decisions that made their works so idiosyncratic. In the March issue of 1957, Bazin also writes a similar thing about Kurosawa, saying that upon a retrospective of his work, this has allowed us to revise our opinion of Kurosawa, who was quite inadequately known in France by only 2 films, Rashomon and The Seven Samurai. Kurosawa was the first among many who was to be re-examined as a studio filmmaker that still held individual creative freedom. This notion in cinema was auteur theory, the idea that a filmmaker had such a distinctive approach that there's an unmistakable character placed upon their films, and whereas previous filmmakers unofficially had the moniker of an auteur applied, now there were emerging an array of contemporary, unheard of artists that were equally applicable to the theory. Perhaps the most astounding aspect of this period comes with this notion of varying auteurs, because when the works of the Japanese directors are examined, each director offers such a unique and distinctive style. You couldn't class the works of the Japanese golden era into a cohesive movement because the styles were so radically different from one another. Ozu cherished his self-imposed restrictions. Kurosawa did everything to break free of any and all restrictions. And the fact of the matter is that their filmographies are so rich that each would require their own retrospective to analyse. They exemplify the turf theory without even consciously putting it into practice. And in the West, it birthed the idea of a cinematic grand master, an artist that hones a singular and characteristic craft over many years. Cinema in the 1950s became the primary way in which Japan was able to recapture the national identity it had lost on the world stage in previous years. In 1958 alone, over 1.1 billion tickets were sold in Japanese cinemas, displaying the passion that the population had for its new burgeoning cinematic culture. Rather than seeking a political resurgence, they sought to affirm their soft power by regaining pride in their culture, as well as promoting that culture as best as they could to Western audiences. And the first true success in that realm came in cinema. The influence of 1950s Japanese cinema can't be underestimated. Even discounting the following decade in which many Japanese filmmakers were still making masterpieces, it was the emergence to the Western world and the reclaiming of its artistic sovereignty that remains the more powerful era. The samurai film gave birth to the spaghetti western, and the films were beyond influential in the developments of techniques within Western cinema. Gate of Hell was the first Japanese film to win the grand prize at the Cannes Film Festival. Again, another staple of the Jidaikai genre. And although it was these historical epics that were bringing more light to Japanese cinema on the main stage, there was still great variety in the film landscape of Japan. Back at Toho, although their main focus was the work of Kurosawa, they developed a new genre of film in 1954, a genre which still runs strong in Japan today. Inspired by a recent event involving a Japanese boat wherein the crew were contaminated by nuclear fallout, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka constructed a creature called Gojira, and Toho's newest focus became the giant monster or kaiju genre. Tanaka sought to combine the newer trend of American monster movies with the ever-present concerns about nuclear activity in Japan to develop these kaiju. Toho are still developing Gojira films to this day, having produced over 30, and during the 1950s added to their selection of monsters with Rodan and Varan. Since being overshadowed by the simple fact that they've been competing with these absolute monoliths of cinema. Director Kon Ichikawa simply hasn't been able to match the exposure of someone like Mizoguchi, who like him was also at Daiei. But when looking at his work, The Burmese Harp was a major success at its time. As was Fires on the Plain, yet the inability to be held alongside their contemporaries of Japanese cinema most likely comes at the cost of his film's grisly nature. During the 1950s, Ichikawa was a director so unafraid to display how gratuitously bleak the war was, and how the Japanese had suffered for it. Its intensity can be matched by the likes of Come and See, but few others. And this is discussing the lesser known directors. Mikio Naruse, who was alongside Kurosawa at Toho, made in the 1950s 5 different adaptations on the work of feminist writer Fumiko Hayashi, alongside around a dozen other separate films in this decade alone.
良い人と一生安らかにいたとて、一生この世の栄養を尽くしたとて、所詮は旅でする身の上だもの。
However, it was these seminal adaptations which gained him the reputation as the preeminent director of women. With most of his protagonists being female, he was the counterbalance to the work of Ozu, painting a picture of the broken family and unfulfilled desires. Yet his work still focused on the concept ever present in Ozu's work of mono no aware, or the pathos of things. The fact of the matter is, we can sit here and talk endlessly about the decade in its entirety, and I've barely scratched the surface. We could devote an entire dissection of the work of Kobayashi, Honda, Tsuburaya, but each of the artists mentioned here deserves their own retrospective. Although Japanese cinema ran strong throughout the following decade, I believe that the golden age runs throughout the 1950s, ceasing at the arrival of the 1960s. The fall of the golden age emerges with the rise of Japan's first major outsider movement, the Japanese New Wave. And here we have artists who actively rejected the aesthetics and thematics of their predecessors, with an aim to transgress and reimagine what Japanese cinema could be. But such is the nature of art. Even as the Japanese New Wave ran strong and made a name for some of the nation's most forward-thinking artists, the legacy of the 1950s remained a landmark for its cinema on an international scale. You could spend your entire study of cinema on this decade alone, and it wouldn't be time wasted. The 1950s cinema of Japan is an era which is perceived in a myriad of different ways. Many remember it as the era of the samurai film, which it was, but it was also the cinema of the humanist family drama, the technicolor epic, the transcendental tale, the monster blockbuster. It was all of these things, and so much more. It was a golden age, because it showed cinema as a catalyst for a people that had had so much taken away from them, a cinema which emphasised the sheer abundance of its quality in the most varied way possible. That cinema was to be led by its grand masters, and it was their works that could fill the cinemas. That film was led by ingenuity. If nothing else, the golden age of Japanese cinema can show us the pinnacle of what cinema can achieve and the standard we should continue to strive for.